Welcome, Martha. This is the third session of the Plan D series that we've been running here at the Comparative Literature Institute of the University of Porto. And today we're going to have a chat with Martha Shearer from University College Dublin. I'm just going to read a short bio, and then we can start the chat. So Martha earned her PhD in film studies I believe it was in film studies, correct me if I'm wrong?
Yeah, that's right.
From King's College London. And she published her first book in 2016, which came out from Palgrave, called New York City and the Hollywood Musical, Dancing in the Streets. She then co-edited the volume Musicals at the Margins, Genre, Boundaries, and Canons, which was released by Bloomsbury this year, 2021. And she is currently co-editing a collection titled Women and New Hollywood. And also you've published, right? Martha has published a number of articles in journals like Screen, the Soundtrack, and the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. And she's now currently an assistant professor at the School of English, Drama and Film at University College Dublin, where I was a couple of years ago, which is why I decided to invite Martha. She was a new arrival, so it was, and sadly we didn't get to hang out with you, but hey, welcome, Martha.
Thank you.
So the first question I want to ask you is about the book, right? Which the book that came out in 2016. And what I wanted to ask you, because I'm assuming that was, the culmination of your PhD project. So what I've been asking other guests is, if you could say a little about, or talk a little about, how you arrived at that particular idea that you then developed in the PhD thesis. Whether you had other ideas that you decided to leave behind, and and why you decided to focus on that particular project, and how you came up with that idea.
So I settled on that, vaguely, that idea during my MA. And so I wasn't kind of choosing between sort of different projects at that point. It developed out of work I did on my master's, where I did my MA dissertation was on Gene Kelly and urban space, and I'd been reading a lot of the literature on cinema in the city, and especially in an American context on film noir. And it seems to me like there is this real cult around kind of film noir, just treating it as kind of special and exceptional. And a lot of that's to do with urban space, and actually the same transformations in American cities that people were connecting to film noir. That wasn't the only genre that happened, because this is a massive transformation of the built environment, and something like the musical actually would routinely get dismissed as this has no relationship to reality whatsoever. So I initially proposed a PhD that would be on urban space in general, in the Hollywood musical and the studio era. And then as I was doing the initial research and trying to kind of map out which particular cities that was happening, it was so overwhelmed by New York that it seemed like that was actually where the project was. At the PhD stage, it had a much narrower time frame than in the book, which I think is, that's a fairly standard sort of PhD to book transition, right? So it was only a kind of 20-year period, and then I expanded it to go from the 30s up to the 70s. And it was trying to engage with literature in geography and urban history, and broader kind of work that came out of the spatial turn, right, and kind of thinking that through in relation to kind of cinematic space, but kind of grounded in a very kind of material sense of urban history. So that's where the idea came from.
And you know, as you were saying, right, like you had to eventually go into all of these different fields, right, like urban planning and geography, and it's a very, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a very also very historical project, right?
Yeah.
So were you and you were in English, I believe, yeah?
I was in film studies.
Film studies, right? So all of these disciplines were kind of new to you, right? So you had to, I assume, do a lot of like basic research.
I know, and I'm doing this with like research I'm doing at the moment, and it's like just a ridiculous thing to do to yourself. I mean, I think it you know, it benefited the work in the end, but it is like you know, years of just feeling bewildered, because you're kind of straying into sort of other disciplines and trying to figure out sort of basic things that they're talking about, and you know, like geography is like a massive discipline, like actually compared to something like film studies, you know, and so trying to kind of make sense of all this stuff, like it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of groundwork to really have a kind of basis for what you're doing. And so I think it took me, like, compared to, you know, other projects, like it took me like quite a while to really pin down the sort of framework for it and the structure, because I was trying to kind of make a sense of bring all this kind of material together. Yeah.
And now you're doing another project on real estate, if I'm correct, right? So that's probably another other.
In many ways, it's worse because I'm having to read all this stuff about finance that is like that can get very technical, and then I sit down and try and figure it out. And I'm like, no, I'm not actually going to use this. Like, so yeah, like finance, and then like if you really want to understand real estate, you really have to go back centuries. I mean, it's like I do this to myself. But you know, it's a sort of lot of reading. At some point this will actually kind of craft its way into a thing. I hope.
No, I mean, but again, like that's kind of also what makes all of these projects that you've been developing kind of cool, right? Because it is sort of unusual to find, like, you know, someone that's going into these like these fields, right? Like at least I don't know that many projects that actually study urban planning and and whatnot. So that's kind of cool and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's been, I mean, over the last, I want to say 20-25 years, there's been a sort of wave of kind of research on sort of cinema and media and the urban or kind of space, and so that work is there. I think sometimes that work can like not do that kind of that volume of kind of groundwork and reading, and like for understandable reasons, because it's really hard.
Right. And I think that actually, let me just jump to another question I had, which is about your article, the article that you published in Screen, right? So which now what you're saying, I think may be related to the question that I wanted to ask you, is why or what you think made the article or chapter, I assume, like, was maybe a chapter from your book that you ended up publishing there?
It was a section of chapters. Okay. So it's different. So it's the West Side Story material is from one of the later chapters in the book, which is looking at how the musical responded to sort of post-war transformations in American cities, like suburbanization and urban renewal principally. So West Side Story is like a bit of that, and then that article also compares West Side Story to earlier musicals that are also based on kind of urban neighborhoods, so that is from an earlier chapter in the book, which is on neighborhood musical, which is much more kind of focused on the 1940s. So it's sort of like taking those two bits and kind of putting them into an article, really.
Cool. No, I mean, what I wanted to ask you, right? What I've been asking other guests that I've had on the series is like, what do you think made this particular article, that good that you thought it would make it into a journal-like screen, right? Is there something? Yeah.
So I think I always felt when I was writing the PhD that the West Side Story material was some of the strongest. And that was down to a couple of things. Firstly, because there were really strong archival kind of collections around West Side Story that I was able to use some of. I mean, not even, I really scratched the surface of what's available, and that's principally because of like the volume of like notable people that were involved in that project means that there are various collections of papers. And so I made a lot of use of the Jerome Robbins papers in New York. And so I found some really interesting archival material related to the film. I also think I felt like the argument I had about that film brought together it ended up being a really pivotal film for the argument I was making, because it sort of it comes as everything that I'm describing is basically collapsing. And so what ends up being interesting about West Side Story is precisely that, but also there's a way that it's kind of that I was reading the film in relation to what's going on in terms of urban renewal, in a way that it always seemed to me like this was one of the most interesting parts of my thesis, and that was like the feedback I got from examiners as well. And so it seemed like if I was going to get the strongest bit of my kind of PhD, it would be based around that. And it wasn't always in that form, actually. Like there was an earlier version of that article that didn't work out at another journal that I won't talk about, but where I was using it with a different film. And actually I ended up reworking it so that it was much more focused on West Side Story specifically.
Cool. Yeah. No, that's really nice and really useful. I think that, I mean, since we're, I guess our audience is, again, early career researchers. So that, it's useful to know that, maybe, we can manage to get like the best part of, as you were saying, like the best part of the thesis and do something like that, right? And you said that you managed to collect a lot of like very useful, important information also from the archives and whatnot. And that's kind of what made it pop, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is the thing, it's like when you are doing a PhD and even afterwards when you're publishing stuff based on that PhD, like there will be people who will have read your work in that kind of earlier form and will be able to be like, that is really strong and like, and I like make use of that, because like later in your career, you don't necessarily have that in the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also, I mean, interesting that you then went on to publish a book that contains a version of that paper, right? So, it would be maybe, it would be maybe easy for a PhD student to just think, I'll just publish the whole thing as a book and that's it, right? Like I'll maybe get a nice book contract and neglect that I have also a nice article here, because we at the end of the day we need both, right?
And I think actually, I mean, I was really, in terms of like job applications, really focused on the UK market, where like you really need a book contract, at the least a book contract, if not a book, to be even in contention for permanent jobs. But I think the thing is, what that means is everyone has a book contract. And actually, I feel like the things that differentiate you are the journals in which you're publishing. And so if you can find something that you can get into like a really high ranked and kind of well-known journal, I think that is the kind of thing that will leap out.
But I'll say this, that I a couple of months ago, I even like caught you talking about this, I think on Twitter, and you were saying precisely that, it's no longer the case that just having a really, top tier publication is no longer enough, right, to guarantee a job, right? So maybe, and I've heard, what I remember then while I was in Ireland, people were already talking about like having a second book, not only like a book contract.
So this is the thing where it's like, you can only do so much. I mean, I always felt like when I was, like, I don't think I would be in a position to work on a second book until now, where I have like a longer contract and, the prospect of job security. I mean, I think when I was sort of working precariously, like, you don't have the capacity to plan a kind of book length project from scratch. Like, you just don't. And I do think any kind of employer expectation that you're doing that is really unreasonable. I mean, you need a concept. You do need to kind of have an idea for a second monograph, I think, actually, increasingly. And like, that's definitely something that, people will expect and will people ask you about at interview. But I think actually kind of like the idea that you would be kind of publishing like 2 monographs while on the job market, I think there are kind of limits.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand. I mean, although, if you go into, for example, when I was at UCB, I was already, I was doing I was on a postdoc scholarship there, and I was working on, and I am working now on a project that is very different from my dissertation. So I am in a way kind of already working on 2 different book length projects at the same time, kind of, right? So I mean, it's not impossible, right?
Yes, I don't know, and like, yeah, and if you have a postdoc, then that is one of the things that can enable you to do that, which is one of the great benefits of doing a postdoc, really. But like, if you're not doing that, right. It's really hard work.
Fair enough. Yeah. No, but I think that's really useful advice, right? Like the fact, because I certainly, that's the first time that I'm hearing that, that all right, and maybe the best part of the best section of your PhD is something that you can turn into an, because in my head it's always been like, okay, this is going to be a book, so I don't really need to, I did publish an article from the dissertation, but I haven't really thought about it again, right? Like anymore in terms of articles, right? So
I mean, you want to make sure that you're not publishing too much of it as articles, because then that's the point when the press will be like,
right,
there's a limit, right? No, but I mean, really. And I think for my book, I'd published like versions of my first 2 articles are in the book, and I got permissions from those journal publishers and whatever, but like, it wasn't ever to an extent that it actually might kind of, it was always below whatever percentage that a publisher might ask for. But I think it's also just kind of, you're building up a kind of a profile and like a body of literature on a subject. So it's a good thing to do, I think.
And just to add that, like when I finished my dissertation, I remember that I was advised to do an embargo on the because I did it in the States. I don't know if that's how it works in the UK or even here. I don't know in Portugal how it works. But I remember that in the States they immediately put it online, right? Like once you defend, right? If you don't embargo the dissertation, it's going to go online, right? And I did, like when I started sending out book proposals, one of the first responses I got was precisely why would we publish your dissertation if it's already online? Like, what are you gonna add any more chapters to it? What are you gonna offer? That is,
you've got to embody that. Like, so when I did my PhD, they introduced the e-thesis. They snuck it in quietly, right before, like really short notice before I submitted. So I kind of downloaded the form that you have to complete when you're submitting it, and I was like, oh, there's all this stuff about you have to agree that your thesis is going to go online. And I remember emailing like the director of postgraduate research in my department and being like, what's this? And she's like, what? I had no idea this was a thing. And I remember my supervisor, he was like, what? So, and you had to sign it and you had to consent in order to submit your thesis. And I kicked up such a fuss about this with like exams, and that they then, I mean, they introduced an embargo policy after that. I mean, not because of me, but like they just hadn't figured it out because they'd snuck it in so quickly. But because I made such a fuss about getting my PhD embargoed that you still can't get it. I don't think you can even get it through the library. Like they just kind of like locked it in a box. It's just completely inaccessible. But I mean, I think it is a real risk, and that you know, you've got to get as long an embargo as possible just to protect yourself, I think.
Yeah, no, like I really didn't think that was, you know, such a big deal. So I although I submitted an embargo, right, like an embargo form, it was only for a year, and I then didn't renew it. So it just went online, and I was like, oh, I didn't even remember this, you know. But yeah, it is important. So you know. So another thing I wanted to ask you, you sort of already talked about that a little, but I wanted to ask you what you went on to do like after finishing the dissertation, right? You said that you were working precariously for a bunch of years or for some time. So
yeah, so for several years afterwards, I was doing like basically like hourly paid teaching jobs, which depending on, well, no, every institution pay nothing. But you know, some institutions, Russell Group universities, pay worse than others. So like the more elite the institution, actually the worse the pay is, from my experience. And doing that whilst at some points I did a lot of temping. So at some points I had kind of like full-time office jobs. And then kind of trying to organize teaching around that, or, you know, doing the summer and then trying to organize research around that.
But were you able to like do research at the same time as you know, you were teaching those?
Let me tell you a little secret. When you have a temp office job, people's expectations will be very low. And also, you don't want to do your work too quickly, because then they run out of stuff to give you to do work, and then they just send you home and you don't get paid. So it's in your interest to find that little middle ground between like doing your job efficiently enough to be impressive so they keep you on, but not doing it too efficiently so they don't have work for you. And a good way to do that is to bring some research in. And what you want is to have your screen somewhere where your boss can't see it. And be doing stuff that your boss can't monitor. So like pay attention to your internet use, and just have stuff that you bring in on a USB stick. That's my top tip. So also at one point I had like a few months I had like a receptionist job, and you can do so much work when you do that, because it's like you have rushes where you're like answering the phone and the rest of the time is super boring. So I remember one kind of reception job where I read loads of Deleuze for some reason while I was like, I don't know why I did that to myself, but I was like, oh, right, good opportunity to read the cinema books. So, you know, there are ways you can get around it. I mean, I did that for a while, and eventually I burnt out genuinely. And what I ended up doing for like a couple of years was sort of freelance transcription work, which I could do from home, and it was, you know, it was entirely on my schedule. I mean, it was also not great pay, but it was something that I could kind of organize on my own time, and that made it a lot easier to do research around it. And so I ended up doing, I mean, I did that when I was writing the book up, actually. I would do a little bit of transcription, I would do a little bit of writing, and I would do it all with kind of Pomodoro technique little sessions. And that was basically how I supported myself. Also because Barclaycard kept irresponsibly raising my credit limit, which was, so I ended up surviving on credit card debt. So that was very helpful, although, you know, unhelpful in other ways. But until I got a kind of teaching fellow job in 2017. so yeah, so I had a few years where, you know, it was really, really hard. And I think it's incredibly difficult psychologically to manage those sorts of stretches, because, you know, the PhD is hard, but it has a goal and it has an end point. And I think the problem, and the really difficult thing to manage with precarity is it doesn't. It's incredibly difficult. And I was, you know, in many ways I was a lot lucky. You know, I speak to friends who are in that position now who have children, or who have disabilities, and it is a nightmare, because you can't just kind of like reorganize your life because someone needs you to start teaching next week. Like, you can't do it. And, you know, you're less kind of internationally mobile and all sorts of things. So the kind of structure of the job market now is going to have real serious exclusionary effects in ways that no one has really thought through.
No, you know, it's really nice. I mean, it isn't nice that you went, you know, through those things, but it's nice that you're sharing that with you know, whoever's watching us, because you know, it is you know, as you were saying, right, like it's very, very dark scenario for most of us, but then you managed to pull off a, as you were saying, right, like a teaching fellowship in 2017. But what do you think you managed to get done during those years that you spent doing this and that you know, allowed you to be in a position to get that?
Well, I mean, I did a lot of teaching, and I developed a lot of teaching experience. I think so. I had a kind of good repertoire, and so I think that was one thing.
Was it, sorry to interrupt, was it teaching related to your field? So was it like film courses and whatnot?
Yes. So it was all in my field. And, you know, I always had a lot of teaching work. When people are like, oh, there aren't any, like, there's so much work, there aren't any good jobs. And I think so. I was doing a lot of kind of teaching on like Hollywood cinema, popular cinema, film history, all this kind of stuff. All, you know, undergraduate film studies teaching at universities in and around London. Like there never was a semester in that period when I wasn't doing some kind of teaching, and sometimes in the summer as well. But yeah, I was very sorry. I was very disciplined and very strategic about where I published. And I think this is, you know, one of the things I did right, actually, was being very disciplined and kind of, I really wanted to get a publication in a kind of big journal. And that was one of the things I prioritized, and the other thing was the book. So there were other things that I was doing, but those were the big priorities. Right. So I think that put me in a good position. I mean, like the department where I got my teaching fellowship was the department where I did my PhD and where I'd done a lot of teaching. Right. So I went into that knowing the curriculum, and, you know, knowing what they wanted from the modules that they were kind of offering. And I think for a position like that, where like a teaching fellowship, you get thrown in at really short notice with a really high teaching load, I think that was, you know, I had experience that was helpful. And I also think like that interview was like the one interview in my life where I walked out of it thinking, I really think I've done everything I could. And I think also it was at a point where, I mean that interview, actually, it came at a point where I'd sat down in the afternoon and been kind of doing some sums and trying to figure out finances, and I was just like, if I don't get a job with a salary this autumn, then I have to find something else to do with my life, because I can't afford to keep doing this. And then the next day I got the interview. And so I think I was very, very kind of focused on preparing for that interview and the presentation, and doing, you know, everything I possibly could for it, because it was like my career would have been over if I'd not got that job, really. so I think, you know, there were things that I'd done to put myself in the best position to be strategic, and I built up a lot of experience, and I had spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, how to use that experience. And you know, they at the kind of interview stage, they wanted you to talk about how to teach one specific module, and you know, I'd done a lot of relevant teaching by that point, so it was something that I was very, very lucky, but also quite well prepared for.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then as you said, you were strategic about like what you published and where, right? And that I'm sure also helped you with getting the UCD position that you have now, right?
Yeah.
So what, you know, I wanted to ask you about that now. Did you have to present a new project that you were supposed to develop at UCD, and like how did that you know, can you again like say a little bit about how you arrived at, you know, whatever idea you ended up presenting?
Yeah, so I had to, I think what we were asked to do was present our research plans for the next 5 years. Yeah, I mean, that phase, but also that's not a kind of an ask that's unique to UCD actually, or unique to this kind of position. Like a lot of places you'll go in and they will want to be like, what are your, even if not framed in that kind of 5-year plan sort of way, like what are your future research plans? So at that point, I already had kind of these plans for these 2 edited collections. So, and then the second monograph was something that I hadn't really been in a position to work on. Like I'd done these smaller kind of projects that were kind of getting there, but I had this idea for a book that I'd kind of wanted to do for a while, and I'd been kind of like thinking about. So, so actually, it wasn't that hard to kind of get to that point where I had like, well, these are the things I want to do over the next few years. And I think, you know, my top tip really would be like, and this comes back to the thing about the second monograph really, is you do need like an idea and a plan for a second monograph, or for like, I don't know if there is a major grant you want to apply for or something like that, like to like serious sort of future plans that you're not just like you've done your PhD and now you're flailing, I think really.
And was this something, because something I wanted to ask you before, and that I've been asking, you know, other people, is like about how you manage your ideas, right, as you move along, right? Like, do you, because like again, like a question I asked the first guest on the show was, you know, whether you had any, you know, backup plans, right? Like, was this the topic that you were you know, always going to develop in the dissertation or not, right? And you know, what people have been telling me is that, you know, yeah, you know, sometimes you do end up you know, not going deep into whatever project you developed a couple of years ago, and this comes back now as something viable to work on, right, as a side project. Or maybe the edited collections that you mentioned were maybe something like that, right? Something that, as you said, that you have you know, back there.
So I had this kind of, I don't know, vague, loose sense of something that I wanted to do that was, for a long time, I'd been thinking that this would be a book about gentrification. And what I ended up doing, I ended up writing a book chapter on television and gentrification. And through the process of writing it, being like, that's not what the book is. Which, like, I don't know what it was. I was just by the end of it, I was like, that's not it. That's not the hook that is going to keep me going for like a few years. And so I think I'd had this sort of idea that was going to be about contemporary cinema and television and urban space. And, you know, I have these kind of smaller projects that I've done that are kind of a lot of kind of book chapter length things that were on, you know, indie cinema in the creative city, or on gentrification, or things like that, that smaller little things. Yeah. And actually through the process of doing these things, what that helped me do was kind of really figure out what the next book was going to be. And there were other points kind of, I think, really soon after I'd finished the PhD, because as soon as you finish the PhD, people are like, well, what's next? And it's horrifying every time. You're like, I have no idea, like, leave me alone. Like, my brain needs to unwind. So there was a point where I thought I wanted to do something on like the Cold War and cities. And it was like not even like, it was as vague as that. But and then yeah, there have been various other things that I've kind of there was a point where I was like, what about where I was thinking of doing something on helicopters. Because, I mean, this is something that I got interested in when I was writing about West Side Story, because it's got this, you know, it's got this long kind of sequence at the beginning of the film that was shot from a helicopter. And I got really into like, you know, the fact that it was shot before the kind of technology that like stabilizes the camera on on like a helicopter. So there's a point where, you know, something like West Side Story, you can see the camera sort of shaking around and it's visibly shot by a helicopter, which seems really interesting. But it's like also like the kind of perspective that it allows and the way that it's kind of coming out of sort of military technology and the way that that helicopters get used in like to enable like location shooting because they get used for location scouting. Mm-hmm. And then there was also all these like weird kind of film and TV shows in like the 1950s where like helicopters attack people or like cops using helicopters. Anyway, I had this whole thing about helicopters that's maybe I'll come back to that at some time. But I
see. Yeah. No, so, yeah, but you know, but you ended up like, yeah, you ended up thinking that maybe, you know, maybe I'll do this some other time, or
yeah, maybe I'll do the helicopters. I mean, I think it's also that I'd been like that first project on that book was very historical, and I wanted to do something that was more contemporary, and I think I wanted to do something that was also more sort of politically engaged, like overtly. So you
have a new West Side Story to work on now, right?
Well, there's also that, which I know, which I'm going to have to see at some point, because yeah,
you're going to have to write about it, maybe, right?
Maybe, you know. Yeah. One of those things that people keep asking about is the new West Side.
Yeah. No, but nice that like the other people that I've been talking to, just people have a bunch of projects going on or thinking about all of these different topics and subjects at the same time, right? Like that's the impression that I have, right? And then ultimately you figure out that, okay, maybe this has the scale or whatever, right? To be a book, right? Or to be a book-length project, and that's, and at least for me, I always find it very liberating to have several things that I'm working on at the same time, because I get stuck, in all of these projects. So
I mean, I definitely, I do have the tendency to actually give myself too many projects to do. Right. This is my downfall always. So I mean, there was a point where I remember being really vividly being in the BFI library and reading this book and being like, oh, this is so good. And I was like, which project was I reading this for? I can't remember, but it is kind of useful for that. But I just like, yeah.
No, but that's really cool, right? And you do, as you were saying, right? Like you do eventually, at least, I speak for myself, but I do eventually end up getting ideas for, whatever main project I'm working on, just by, going through all of these random other things that I'm interested in, right? So at least it really helps you divert your attention from whatever main thing you're working on, and then come back to it with a more refreshing look or perspective on whatever it is. So I find it useful. Another thing I wanted to ask you is about your writing practice. Because and that and especially as you said, like since you were living under precarious conditions for a bunch of years, how did you manage to navigate that in terms of like writing, right? Were you writing every day? Were you writing only during, the summer or something, or during the weekend. How did you manage to pull it off, right? Especially working under those conditions.
So I think it varies at different points. So when I was writing up the book, I was basically writing every day, mainly because it gave me like something to do that wasn't transcription, which when you kind of spend a lot of time like transcribing like marketing meetings, like it's, it can be very tedious. So I would alternate between the two to sort of like keep myself sane. So then I was writing really frequently. I think at other points, I mean, one of the other things I did, which was really helpful, is my friend Chris Holliday used to run these sessions, well, still does, I'm sure, called Right Now at King's, which were these day-long sort of writing sessions, and they'd be catered. It was, you get all the best crisps that King's had to offer, and coffee and stuff like that. But it was a group, and it was dedicated for ECRs, and especially ECRs that had a lot of teaching. And there were kind of half-day and day-long sessions really regularly throughout term. And I have an article that I basically wrote at those sessions, which was a really useful way to kind of get some writing done during term time.
What was that, like once a week?
It was a few times a term. So there would be day-long sessions at the end of term and during reading week, and then there'd be like half-day sessions in sort of in between those sorts of sessions. But it was really good to have some concentrated time and some peer pressure. And I think, and otherwise I would just kind of like have days or afternoons where I would just block things out, and that would be the kind of writing session. I would go to the library specifically to do that. So I think, it does help to kind of have some sort of disciplined time that you kind of block out. Because I think if you're trying to do it around everything else, and especially around email, it can be really hard to kind of have the sort of headspace to actually do any thinking. Like, I think that's the hardest thing, actually, when you have a lot of commitments, to actually feel like you have some space to actually really do some writing that isn't just functional.
And what about like, what about now? I mean, if you allow me to ask, like now I assume, right, that you have a little bit more time, right, to dedicate to research. And
I mean, theoretically, I guess. I mean, like the pandemic has really not helped. So I think it's like trying to get anything done and to have any kind of headspace right now it's been really, really hard. Mm-hmm. So I guess I kind of objectively have more time, but that's not to say that it's actually any more productive. Because the conditions we're working under right now are so challenging. I
mean, I do like, again, like speaking for myself, I do find that having too much time is also a problem, right? Yeah. You do have to figure out how to, constrain yourself or force yourself to write, So those, writing sessions that you were talking about, for sure, or in peer pressure, for sure, end up helping a lot, I think.
I think it's also that my tendency, which I'm very much experiencing at the moment, is always a tendency to read too much,
right?
And to try and read everything. And so I really, really need to train myself continually to be like, you need to stop reading and do some writing. And I think that's the great problem I have at the moment, because you always feel like, well, there's so much that I have to read, and I have to read everything written about neoliberalism, and it's like, well, no one's done that. Read, right?
Yeah, and finish reading those Deleuze books. I'm actually doing a reading group now with a couple of students, and we're going through the Cinema 1 and 2, like chapter by chapter.
Oh, nice. That sounds great.
Yeah, they're very keen on finishing everything. So that's, that's nice. I always wanted to read the, because I never actually have read them. Or only skimmed. So
yeah,
it's nice. So, last question I had for you was or is whether you can think of something, that, looking back retrospectively, something that you wish you had known, like maybe when you finished the dissertation and were going into the job market and, and going into whatever, situation that you were describing, and you're like, would you do anything like differently?
Oh my God, I do so many things differently. Like,
please,
I mean, I think the departments I'm familiar with now are doing a lot more to train their graduates for the job market in a way that just didn't happen when I finished. So I didn't have any clue what I was doing. And like, there are things that people are expecting you to do when you're writing a cover letter that I only figured out like years in. And I mean, so I think it would have made my life so much easier if I'd had more support. But also, I mean, I think I always kind of was focused on like, well, I'm applying for lectureships or kind of teaching jobs. And I didn't really kind of look into like postdocs or kind of grants or that side of something, because I always just felt like I don't want to give myself more things to write up when I've already got this thesis that I haven't written up. But I think actually that was probably a mistake. But it's also just like trying to keep track of like the whole grant landscape on top of everything else just seemed like such hard work.
Right.
So I never really did that. And also, there was only so much time I had for applications. Like writing a kind of a proper job application is really time consuming. And if you have a lot of time pressures, it's really hard to do. And there are some jobs where I'm like, oh, I wish I had applied for that. But, I don't know. I think there's a lot that I could have done better. But actually, you can only do so much as just a person. And I think in a lot of ways, like, it's a question that I think everyone is sort of asking themselves, everyone who's on the job market, who's kind of, recently got a job, like, what could I have done differently? What could I have done better? But really, you're in like an absolute nightmare of a job market, like really, really bad, and getting worse always, and getting so much worse with COVID. Like, I feel so lucky that I got a job right beforehand. And actually, I feel like that's a question that really needs to be asked of institutions and of departments, of like what they can do better to support their graduates. Because I feel like taking on a PhD student right now, it's a real kind of ethical conundrum. And, I think departments are finally kind of cottoning on to the fact that they really, really, really need to do a lot more to support their students and to support their graduates. And maybe need to rethink their hiring practices as well. This is just a situation for which no individual can really prepare that well, I feel like. So it's such a downer.
No, that's true. And my concern, I mean, I fully, of course, agree with what you're saying, that departments, and I think, I mean, at least the departments that I know, I mean, I think that UCB does pretty well at the,
yeah, I think they're doing a lot more this year, I think, in a way that's really positive. And I think they do pretty well from what I can tell. But yeah, I think some of that kind of support that the departments I'm familiar with are offering is it's a really recent phenomenon and should have been happening for the last decade at least. Really.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but my concern is, and again, like, partly the reason why I'm doing this is because I feel that especially PhD students, as you were saying, right, like while you were writing your dissertation, you didn't really think about what you were going to do later or after the thesis, right? Because the thesis was sort of consuming your whole time, right? But I at least, again, like, speaking for myself, I feel that, I would have liked to be warned, right, like, of the things that I should be taking into account then, right? Because
Yeah.
then you're sort of thrown,
thrown to the wolves. Yeah, and I do think
very little help. So
yeah, and I think it's certainly something I try to talk to my own PhD student about, that like you need to kind of,
right.
I think it's really, really difficult circumstances right now, and you need to, I think it's anyone who is kind of dealing with PhD students, you need to make sure that they're aware of that they're going in with their eyes open, and that they're kind of thinking about what else they might want to do as well. Because, it's a good job, but it's just a job, and it's it's not a divine calling. It's a job like any other, and there are plenty of other jobs.
Sure. Even though, I mean, that's
no, and I was really bad at thinking that way. I was always like, I have to do this, I can't do anything else. And I think that was cruel optimism, basically. And in a way that was not great for me for a lot of that time. And I realized that I'm speaking as one of the lucky ones that has got like an assistant professor job. So now it all seems like it was worth it, but
right.
And I'm in a position where I can be like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have done it, but it's a kind of moot point because I did and I got here. But for plenty of other people who are kind of way more brilliant than me, like that's not the case. And I mean it's everything's horrible. I mean, I do think like what I wish I had done, and what I think I would advise anyone to do, is to not, even if you're not necessarily like giving yourself a kind of a time when you would kind of get out, like if I don't have a kind of secure job by X year, then I'll stop, or kind of just what are the conditions, what are the kind of point I would have to get to, like that's not kind of time focused, where I would have to think about doing something else, because I think that gives you a bit more of a kind of sense of agency over the whole process, rather than just this continual like auditioning and waiting and feeling like you have to dance for people for their approval, and just feeling like I think for a long time I felt like I'd done everything that you're supposed to do and I still didn't have a job, like it was like a video game. And like, why am I not getting to the boss level? And it honestly got much better for me when I started to think of it like the Kobayashi Maru from Star Trek, where it's a game where it's not about winning, it's about a test of your kind of resilience in a no-win situation. Like that is really what the job market feels like. So you have to let go of this idea that you're going to beat the big job market boss. But I do think like giving yourself like an endpoint and an exit, and thinking about what that might be, is actually going to be increasingly really important.
Yeah, but I mean, as you were saying, what worries me is that you were saying something that's really important, is that departments should now consider whether they should take more students. And I think in at Buffalo, where I went to school, they're already only accepting very few, right?
Yeah,
and that's nice, right? But then people that are already or finishing the dissertation now, right, or it's very difficult, as you were suggesting, to sort of get out of that mindset that this is my calling, right? This is what I really want to do, right? Because most of us, the reason why we decided to pursue a PhD was precisely because we really like it. We really want to.
I think the other thing is that I think only accepting very few PhD students, like that's definitely the decision that I've taken. But I think the risk with that is that who are those very few students that you take on? Do they end up being like the elite students who've had the time and the resources and the support to develop a really strong application? Like, I think there are real questions that need to be asked there. And I think, everyone needs to join a union, basically, because universities are making these decisions like there is no shortage of work. There is absolutely no shortage of work. It is not that the work is not available, it's that that work doesn't translate into secure jobs. And so everyone needs to be kind of doing what they can to sort of organize against that. Because I mean, it's undermining the profession as a whole. It's undermining, you know, universities and the education they're able to provide if they aren't, if the working conditions of those staff aren't secure.
It's true. I mean, it's you know, endless supply, right, of cheap labor, right, and that's, as you said, that's a problem that's been that it's an old problem, right? So
it's an old problem that's just getting worse. And I think that, you know, the way that kind of universities have pressures that, you know, so it's part of like promotion that you kind of, you know, promotion kind of requirements most places, if not everywhere, that you kind of supervise the kind of X number or like, you know, number of kind of PhD students. So it's that there's an incentive for people to take on students despite what kind of ethical decision they might have made. You know, there are all these kind of ways in which there are kind of pressures from all sides. And like, you know, I've known people who've been told by senior management, well, if you don't take on more PhD students, like where are you going to get that cheap labor from that we rely on to run our programs? So, you know, it's a kind of university management problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Much more than it is like a departmental decision or a kind of like, you know, what can a student do to prepare themselves?
Yeah, true. Fair enough. Yeah. But, you know, in any case, my hope at least is that at least, you know, the reason why I'm kind of doing this is that at least a couple of people that listen, that are already, you know, on track to get on, you know, on the job market soon, you know how bad it is.
Yeah, but it's also just like, you know, all you can do as someone who is applying for jobs is put yourself in the best position that you can. And so you know, I think I've talked about being strategic with publication. So like with kind of, when I was kind of hourly paid teaching, there was stuff I turned down because it wasn't kind of adding something. I was like, well, if that's teaching an MA that I haven't done that before, then I will do it. You know, if it's supervising dissertations that I haven't done it before, I'll take that on. But if it's not teaching in a new area, or if it's not teaching at a different kind of level or giving me something new for my CV, then I won't do it, because I only have, you know, limited amount of time. And you know, like thinking strategically about where are the weaknesses in your CV and how can you put yourself in the best position possible. And I think that's really all you can do. And then once you're kind of doing that, then it really is just luck. You know, it's like, were you in the right place at the right time for the right job? That's really all it is. And anyone who has got a job in the last few years has above all else been lucky.
Yeah, right.
And I think anyone who won't say that to you is lying to people and themselves probably as well. Like, it's not that, you know, those of us who have jobs are just so much more brilliant, or like, it's really, really not. It was just luck. And, you know, and there were other times when I wasn't lucky, like for a long time. And that's just the kind of the circumstance you're in. So you can, you know, figure out how best to kind of present your CV and how best to write your cover letter and all those sorts of things. And you can work on having the best publication record that you can develop under the circumstances. But like, beyond that, there's only so much you can control.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Martha. I mean, it is what it is, you know. I mean, so it's bleak as I remember, you know, going to when I got to UCD a couple of years ago, I went to the, you know, training sessions that they do, you know, for ECRs. And then I got back to my mentor's you know, office and was you know, telling her like all the things that people were saying, and she was like, yeah, you know, that's they shouldn't be saying those things, you know, because it's such a dire, you know, scenario that it's not that bad, you know. But, and it is, right? Like, you really have to worry, right? And you know, the sense I have, as you were saying, right, is that at least from speaking to other PhD students and whatnot, is that they're not really, and I understand, right, that that's not their priority, right? That their priority is to, you know, write the dissertation and get the writing done, right? It's not even write a good dissertation; it's just write the dissertation, right? Just get as much writing done as possible. But I really think that maybe, you know, thinking ahead might save you a lot of heartache.
I think if you're starting a PhD now, you unfortunately need to be thinking about well, kind of if you want to go into academia, and you might find that you don't, and that's good for you, my God, what your plan B is, and to have a kind of very serious plan B, that and to be kind of thinking about kind of how you move towards that as well, but also what you need to do to put yourself in a stronger position as possible by the time that you graduate. And so to be thinking about publication from really early on, and to be thinking about building up teaching experience and kind of organizing events and all this kind of stuff, that, you know, when I did my PhD, it was like, well, some people did that. But it, you know, it wasn't ever impressed upon me that this is absolutely necessary and this will really benefit you by the time you end, etc., etc. But I think things are so much worse now.
Yeah.
And it, you know, it remains to be seen what will happen after the pandemic, I guess. Like, but yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, Martha. No, I mean, I hope that you know, people do get, because you did share, you know, in my opinion, in any case, you did, you know, say a lot of, you know, very useful things about how to navigate the whole thing, right? So, you know, I do hope people, you know, this is gonna go on YouTube. So, hey, thank you very much, Martha.
No problem.
And I'll see you on Facebook.
See you online.
You know, see you soon. Bye. Thank you very much.